Why does your life feel rushed even when you are not technically out of time? Look at the last 7 days. Not the calendar, not the meetings, not the list of things you told yourself had to be handled. Look at the actual hours. Where did they go? Can you account for them honestly? Can you say that the time you had was spent in the direction of what you actually value? Most people cannot. Worse, most people do not notice they cannot. That is the real danger. You are not exhausted only because life is short. You are exhausted because your hours are leaving without resistance, quietly, daily, with your participation. You are not merely busy. You are being emptied. This is not a modern problem. It only has modern tools. The structure is ancient. It was diagnosed with brutal precision 2,000 years ago by a man who lost years of his life to exile, returned, and then watched the people around him lose the rest voluntarily. That man was Seneca. He was not speaking as a poet admiring the mystery of time. He was speaking as someone who had seen how people surrender a life without ever making a clear decision to do so. What he saw was simple and devastating. Life does not usually get stolen in dramatic ways. It gets donated in fragments. An hour here, a day there. A season surrendered to urgency, vanity, fear, politeness, appetite, ambition, and delay. By the time the pattern becomes visible, much of the life is already gone. The Stoic argument is not that you need more time. It is that you need to stop handing away the time you already possess. What follows are 8 hard observations and one final demand. Not about productivity, not about optimization, about possession, about whether your hours belong to you or to whatever asks loudly enough. By the end, you should be able to see with painful clarity where your life is leaking and what must change if you intend to take it back. Seneca knew what it meant for time to be interrupted from the outside. Born in Cordoba, raised for public life, trained in rhetoric and philosophy, he rose into influence in Rome and then lost years to imperial exile under Claudius. For a man built for public movement, exile was a forced collision with stillness. Court vanished, status loosened, obligation thinned. The machinery that normally claims a person hour by hour fell silent. And in that silence, he saw something most people never see until it is too late. Time is the only possession that is actually yours while it is being used. Property can be seized, rank can be revoked, health can be damaged, reputation can be altered by fools, enemies, or luck. But time has a more severe rule. Once spent, it does not return. It cannot be appealed. It cannot be repurchased. It cannot be restored by apology, regret, influence, or intelligence. It leaves once. When Seneca returned to Rome, he saw people differently. He saw what they were doing with the only possession that cannot be recovered. They were wasting it. Not in obviously disgraceful ways, in respectable ways, in socially rewarded ways, in ways people still confuse with living. They gave time to appearances, to rehearsed conversations, to pointless obligations, to ambitions that reproduced themselves, to pleasures that ended where they began, to worries about futures that never arrived in the form imagined. They called all of this a full life. Seneca called it loss. The first observation is the one most people resist because it eliminates the excuse they prefer. The problem is not primarily that life is short. The problem is expenditure. That shift changes everything. If the problem were duration, then you would be a victim of a universal limit and there would be nothing to examine except mortality itself. But if the problem is expenditure, then the question becomes harder. What exactly are you spending your life on? What has a claim on your hours? Which claims were chosen, and which were accepted because refusing them felt uncomfortable? Most people blame external causes for where their time goes. Work, demands, family pressure, messages, interruptions, circumstances. Some of that is real. Stoicism does not deny constraint. But Seneca's point is sharper than that. Much of what you call lost time was not taken. It was given. The 2-hour conversation that led nowhere. The evening spent in mental rehearsal for a future that never arrived. The week shaped entirely by someone else's priorities. The endless attention given to people whose opinions do not deserve authority over your life. These were not thefts. They were donations. This matters because theft produces resentment towards circumstance. Donation forces a question of agency. If you gave it, you can stop giving it. If you stop giving it, the structure of your days changes. That is why this first observation is so uncomfortable. It locates the leak closer to you than you wanted. The second observation explains why this leak continues for so long without being noticed. Most people do not lose their time to the present. They lose it to deferral. Seneca saw this clearly. The pattern is everywhere. I will rest when this season ends. I will live properly when the pressure drops. I will be present when the children are older. I will write when I have more margin. I will begin when things are finally settled. But the conditions do not settle. The threshold moves. The future keeps asking for one more concession before the real life can begin. This is not accidental. A mind trained to defer does not become free when the deferred conditions are finally met. It simply finds new conditions. The person waiting for permission to live almost never notices that the permission structure is self-renewing. Seneca named the mechanism with brutal simplicity. While we delay, life passes. Not slows, not pauses, passes. That is the severity of it. Delay feels temporary from the inside. Its consequences are permanent. You imagine you are postponing the beginning of life. In reality, you are using life to prepare for life. The project ends and another one replaces it. The finances improve and new needs appear. The children grow and different demands arrive. The calendar clears and the mind, long trained to postpone, fills it again. The person says later with total sincerity, not realizing that later has become the most efficient device ever invented for dissolving a life. The third observation strikes at something the modern world praises constantly. Busyness is not proof of direction. Seneca was suspicious of the busy, not because labor is bad, not because work is beneath a serious life, because busyness is one of the most effective disguises waste has ever found. The busy person is rarely idle. The hours are filled, the agenda is crowded. The day appears important from the outside, but there is a decisive difference between being occupied and being directed. Occupied means your hours are claimed. Directed means your hours are moving towards something you have actually examined and decided matters. Many people are occupied all day and directed almost never. That is why busyness is so attractive. It answers the question of what to do next before the deeper question can even be asked. Toward what? For whom? At what cost? Why is this worth a life? The calendar fills. The tasks multiply. Motion creates the feeling of meaning. And because motion is continuous, there is no silence in which direction has to justify itself. Marcus Aurelius understood this danger from the center of power. He governed an empire, commanded armies, managed famine, plague, betrayal, law, logistics, diplomacy, succession. His life was filled with legitimate demands, yet he still warned himself not to confuse the occupation of his role with the direction of his life. That distinction matters. A full calendar is not evidence of a well-used life. It is only evidence that many things manage to enter it. The person who is always moving can go years without ever discovering whether the movement is worthy. The fourth observation is where Stoicism becomes practical and severe. If time is the only possession that is genuinely yours, then protecting it is not a preference, it is a duty. Seneca begins one of his letters with a command that sounds almost rude in its force. Reclaim yourself. Then he gets more specific. Seize the hours. Guard them. Hold them. That language is not poetic excess. It reflects the reality of what is happening. No one arrives in your life intending to protect your time for you. Other people think in terms of their own needs, their own convenience, their own urgency. That is not wicked. It is ordinary. The problem is structural. If you do not guard your hours, they will be assigned by louder priorities. This happens not mainly through dramatic events, but through small, reasonable claims. The meeting easier to attend than to decline. The obligation accepted months ago by a version of yourself who assumed the future would contain endless strength. The conversation that required your body when 2 sentences would have solved it. The request that sounds trivial until multiplied by 100 other trivial claims. Each one feels harmless. Together they form the architecture of a stolen week. Stoicism forces the arithmetic into the light. Every yes is also a no, not metaphorically, literally. Every agreement displaces something else. The question is never only, should I do this? The real question is, what am I not doing, not building, not protecting, not becoming because I said yes here? That is not selfishness. It is consciousness. An examined yes and an automatic yes may look identical from the outside. Internally, they are opposite acts. One is chosen, the other is drift. A life is built from the difference. This is also why boundaries feel so morally confusing to people who have spent years confusing usefulness with goodness. If your identity was built around availability, then refusing a demand feels like selfishness even when the demand is trivial and your hour is not. If your self-respect was built around being easy to reach, easy to use, easy to place into someone else's emergency, then reclaiming time feels like betrayal. But Stoicism does not ask whether refusal is socially pleasant. It asks whether the use of life is rational. A life can be ruined by generosity when generosity operates without judgment. The fifth observation is the one Seneca made with the most personal urgency. The person who plans to start living later is usually constructing an alibi, not a plan. Somewhere in the middle of his writing on time, the argument tightens. It becomes less like philosophy and more like indictment. He describes the person who intends to begin the real life once the current demands calm down, once the work stabilizes, once the family needs less, once retirement arrives, once the practical stage is over and the meaningful stage can finally begin. But the practical stage never ends. It changes costume and continues. This is what makes the alibi so effective. Each delay sounds temporary. Collectively, they become a whole life. The person spends decades preparing to live and then dies in preparation. The future was never a destination. It was a device for excusing the surrender of the present. That is why Stoicism keeps bringing death into the frame, not as morbidity, not as theatrical darkness, as calibration. The person who lives as though time is abundant makes unlimited concessions. The person who remembers it makes different decisions. Behave as if the end is near, not with panic, with clarity. The point is not to become dramatic. The point is to stop being vague. What would you still give your hours to if you remembered they are not renewable? Which commitments would survive that pressure? Which ones would collapse immediately? Your real values are often revealed not by what you say matters, but by what remains when mortality is allowed into the room. And this is where most people become frightened. Not because death is a dark subject, but because clarity is a severe one. Clarity forces ranking. It asks which conversations deserve a life and which only consume one. Which ambitions are worthy and which are elaborate postponements. Which loyalties are real and which are inherited reflexes you never examined. Death is frightening partly because it removes the right to pretend that all commitments are equal. They are not. Some deserve your years. Some do not deserve your next hour. The sixth observation is one of the hardest for modern people to accept. Most of what feels urgent is not important, and most of what is important rarely feels urgent. Urgency is loud. Important things are often quiet. That is why so many lives become inverted. The message receives immediate attention. The insult gets a response. The deadline governs the day. The practical fire consumes the week. Meanwhile, the relationship that needs repair, the practice that would stabilize the mind, the reading that would sharpen judgment, the conversation that would restore direction, the work that actually belongs to your deepest commitments, all of it waits quietly and is therefore endlessly postponed. The tragedy is not only that urgent things consume time, it is that they train the nervous system to mistake loudness for value. The mind begins to trust pressure more than importance. What shouts gets the life, what matters waits. And then years pass. The work never written remains unwritten. The person never called is no longer there to call. The relationship that could have been repaired no longer exists in a form that can receive repair. The self you meant to become remains conceptual because concept was always easier than schedule. The genuinely important things are patient. That is exactly why weak lives keep neglecting them. Patience gets mistaken for permission to wait. It is not permission. It is mercy, and mercy expires. A Stoic life is not built by reacting efficiently to the urgent. It is built by protecting what matters from the urgent. That requires conflict. It requires disappointing people. It requires letting some noise remain noise. It requires the strength to watch a loud thing remain unanswered, while a quiet thing is finally given its due. Many people would rather stay overwhelmed than endure the guilt of that kind of choice. So they keep calling themselves responsible while abandoning what is actually important. The seventh observation sounds paradoxical until you understand it. The only part of time you can fully possess is the part you actually inhabited. The future is uncertain. The present is vanishing while you speak. The past alone is fixed. That means the only hours you can truly own are the hours that were lived with enough attention to remain yours. A distracted hour disappears twice, once while it happens, and again when it cannot even be remembered as a life that was truly entered. This is why attention matters so much in Stoicism. A person who was fully present in an hour owns it permanently. Not because memory freezes it perfectly, but because the hour was actually lived. It entered the structure of the self. It became real possession. The person who is always mentally elsewhere builds a past made of absences. The body was there, perhaps. The mind was in anticipation, comparison, worry, fantasy, rehearsal, resentment. The hour passed. Nothing was truly inhabited. That hour is lost in a way more final than theft, because theft at least leaves the fact of possession behind. Inattention leaves almost nothing. This is not nostalgia. Seneca had no patience for people who retreated into the past to avoid the present. The point is more demanding. Live the hour so completely that you would not be ashamed to remember it. That single standard would change many days. It would change how you eat, how you speak, how you listen, how often you fracture your attention across 3 screens and call that ordinary life. It would change how often you remain half-present in rooms you claim matter to you. It would change the way you treat conversation, solitude, reading, work, walking, waiting, and silence. The person who inhabits an hour is not necessarily doing something grand. They are simply there, whole, undivided. That is rarer than talent. The 8th observation is the one aimed at people who imagine that understanding is already transformation. Knowledge that does not alter behavior is decoration. Seneca and the Stoics were unusually severe about this. The person who reads, discusses, quotes, analyzes, and remains unchanged has not learned in the only sense that matters. They have collected ideas and hung them on an unchanged life. That is not wisdom. It is ornament. This point matters because philosophy is uniquely vulnerable to becoming performance. A person can speak beautifully about virtue while spending their days in contradiction to it. They can explain calm and remain ruled by irritation. They can discuss mortality and still live as though life begins later. They can admire discipline and never build a single day around it. Seneca had seen enough of this to become almost ruthless about it. A Stoic is not someone who has studied Stoicism. A Stoic is someone whose hours have been rearranged by it. That is the dividing line. If the reading did not alter the schedule, the reading remained mostly cosmetic. If the insight did not enter behavior, it stayed in the mind as comfort. If the principles did not become practice, then the intellect was entertained, not transformed. This is where many intelligent people fail. They mistake recognition for change. They hear the truth, feel the sting of it, even admire it, and then return to the same distribution of time. The admiration becomes a substitute for obedience. Stoicism refuses that substitution. What matters is not whether you can explain the principle. What matters is whether your life has bent around it. That is why beautiful understanding can actually delay transformation. It gives the ego the pleasure of contact with truth without the pain of rearrangement. It allows a person to feel close to the good while remaining structurally loyal to the old pattern. Seneca is merciless about this because he knows how seductive the counterfeit is. It is easier to talk about reclaiming a life than to stop spending nights in escape, days in drift and years in postponement. The ninth observation concerns a different kind of waste, one that many people defend as freedom. Unstructured comfort can waste a life as efficiently as overwork. There is a reason this is so hard to see. Overwork announces itself as sacrifice. Comfort often disguises itself as recovery. The first looks respectable. The second looks harmless. But a day can be lost softly just as easily as violently. It is possible to ruin a year without a single crisis, simply by letting appetite decide the shape of too many ordinary afternoons. Seneca understood that a person can abandon themselves in silk as thoroughly as in chaos. That is why Stoicism does not ask only whether something feels good or whether something feels demanding. It asks what kind of person this pattern is making. Is this pleasure restoring strength for a worthy use? Or is it training you to need constant ease before you can act? Is this rest preparing judgment? Or is it lowering your threshold for discomfort? A person who cannot voluntarily enter difficulty when reason requires it does not possess freedom. They possess preference, and preference becomes tyranny the moment life stops cooperating. The Stoics practiced voluntary hardship partly for this reason. Not because pain is holy, not because deprivation is automatically noble, because choosing difficulty on purpose breaks the illusion that comfort is necessary for strength. The cold bath, the plain meal, the silence, the walk without distraction, the deliberate refusal of excess. These are not performances. They are rehearsals in sovereignty. They remind the body and the mind that a life does not collapse the moment convenience disappears. Without that training, comfort becomes judge, and whatever comfort dislikes gets postponed. Then the hard conversation waits. The disciplined morning waits. The important work waits. The truth waits. A person can slowly become obedient, not to reason, but to mood. And once mood becomes ruler, time can no longer be directed with consistency. Seneca distinguishes between the compulsively busy and the compulsively idle. Both can lose a life. One loses it in ceaseless motion. The other loses it in shapeless ease. Leisure, when it is not ordered toward restoration for something meaningful, becomes another anesthetic. Pleasure without direction. Rest that restores nothing because nothing worthy is being restored for. Seneca was not hostile to pleasure. He was wealthy, cultivated, socially intelligent, fully aware of the good things available in a refined life. His concern was not with enjoyment itself. It was with dependence. The person who can only judge a day good if it was pleasant has surrendered authority over the standard of a good day. That surrender matters, because pleasure is easy to multiply and meaning is hard to construct. A life organized around comfort gradually becomes unable to tolerate the discomfort required for depth. Then even leisure becomes thin. It no longer enriches, it merely sedates. Real rest is not simply the absence of effort. It is the kind of restoration that returns a person to what matters with more clarity, more gratitude, and more force. Rest that sharpens is different from rest that dissolves. A free day can deepen a life or empty it. The difference is whether the person knows what the day is for. This is why the modern dream of escape so often disappoints. The person imagines that relief from pressure will automatically produce meaning. It does not. Remove the schedule from a disordered mind and the disorder simply spreads. Remove the office and distraction invents itself at home. Remove obligation and appetite rushes in to occupy the vacuum. Freedom without direction is not liberation. It is exposure. It reveals whether there is anything inside strong enough to order the day once pressure disappears. The final observation gathers all the others. The only life that is long enough is the life that is fully inhabited. That claim is not sentimental. It is architectural. A life feels short not merely because years pass fast, but because so little of it was truly entered. Whole stretches vanish because the person was physically present and internally absent. They were scrolling, reacting, waiting, comparing, anticipating, recovering, postponing. They were somewhere near their own life, but not fully in it. This is why return matters more than fantasy. Many people lose time twice. First in the drift itself, then in the shame that follows the drift. They discover they have wasted a week, a month, a decade, and the discovery produces paralysis. Stoicism rejects that paralysis too. The standard is not that you never drift. The standard is that you stop worshiping the drift once you see it. You return. You return without theatrics. You return without self-pity. You return because the hour in front of you still exists and still asks the same question it asked before you failed it. Will you use me deliberately or not? That is the quiet severity of Stoicism. It does not flatter you with the promise of a new life delivered all at once. It gives you something more demanding and more real. 1 hour recovered honestly. 1 day arranged around value instead of noise. 1 refusal that protects what matters. 1 act of attention strong enough to make a moment fully yours. Then another. Then another. That is how a life stops leaking, not through inspiration. Through possession repeated until it becomes character. That sentence contains the entire argument. Not a life without drift. Not a life without distraction, urgency, weakness, appetite, delay, or pressure. Those do not disappear. The difference is return. The person whose life becomes real is not the person who never strays. It is the person who keeps returning to what they have decided matters. That is why Seneca's argument cuts so deeply. He is not demanding perfection. He is demanding possession. He is asking whether your life belongs to your examined judgment or to the next loud thing, whether your days are arranged by value or by pressure, whether you are living now or preparing to live later, whether your attention enters the hours deeply enough for them to become yours, whether you know enough to change, whether you rest in a way that restores meaning rather than replacing it. And behind all of these questions stands the same fact. Time is passing regardless of your theory about it. Seneca was ordered to die under Nero. The accounts describe composure, but the important point is not that he died calmly. It is that his composure was the product of a life spent examining what time was and what a person is supposed to do with it. He did not discover his philosophy at the end. He had been practicing it for decades. That is why the end did not find him unprepared. This is where the argument becomes personal. You are not running out of time merely because life is finite. You are running out of time because portions of your life are being donated to what you never truly examined, to busyness that disguised drift, to urgency that displaced importance, to futures that kept asking for one more postponement, to the hope that later would finally become a place where you could begin. Later is not coming as a rescue. If your life is going to become yours, it will happen by the recovery of hours, not by the fantasy of new circumstances. It will happen when you begin protecting time before it feels urgent, when you stop calling busyness direction, when you refuse to let comfort decide what a good day is, when you stop preparing endlessly for a life that can only be lived now. 1 fully inhabited hour is more real than a year spent in postponement. That is the Stoic demand. Not that you become dramatic, not that you become extreme, that you become honest enough to see where your life is going and disciplined enough to interrupt the pattern. Think again about last week, the actual hours, not what you intended, not what you told yourself, what really happened. Which hours were yours? Which ones were donated? Which ones were inhabited deeply enough to remain part of a life rather than part of a blur? That discomfort is useful. It is information. The answer is not to become obsessed with control. The answer is to stop living as though time is an abstract quantity and start treating it as the only possession that disappears while you are using it. You do not need a new life before you begin. You need a recovered hour. Then another. Then the courage to organize the next day around what you already know is true. Take back your time. Do it before the pattern hardens further. Do it before later demands another year. Do it while the hour in front of you is still yours.